I was in my moment of prayer when it happened again. The living room television turned on by itself in the dead of night, the volume rising slowly as if something wanted to interrupt my communion with God. A cold sensation ran down my spine while the house lights began to flicker in a steady rhythm. It was no coincidence. I felt that oppressive presence that had been growing in our home for weeks. When I lifted my eyes, I saw my granddaughter Bianca standing in the hallway, watching with an empty, almost mechanical look. "Grandma," she whispered in a voice that was not quite hers, "she said you will give up." My heart raced, but my faith did not falter. Evil had not come from outside, it was using someone I loved. I breathed in, and even with trembling hands, I did not step back. That battle had only just begun. My name is Teresa Ferreira, and I begin most days with a small, faithful liturgy. I rise at 5, make the same pot of coffee, and sit in my old rocking chair on the veranda while morning light folds softly across the yard. I speak aloud to God the things I carry, and the ordinary rhythm of that prayer steadies me like a hand on my shoulder. The house smells of coffee and lemon cleaner. The curtains keep the world gentle. A Bible in the corner holds my notes, underlined verses, dates, names. I keep it close as one keeps a familiar face. I have been a widow for 12 years. Loss taught me how to stand without falling apart. I learned small industries of endurance, how to make a single light warm a room, how to make a meal feel like a promise, how to bless a troubled heart and mean it. My daughters grew up seeing a woman who knelt at hard moments and sang at grateful ones. Gabriella learned to pray with her hands clasped. Clara learned to fold paper prayers and hide them in books. They learned that faith is not a show but a way of keeping breath steady when the storm comes. When Bianca came to live with us after Gabriella's divorce, she brought a son I had not expected. She laughed like it was her job. She asked small, fierce questions about the world. She touched the plants as if she believed they could answer. For weeks our house was full of small joys, the scuff of small feet on the tile, crayon marks on a cereal box, bedtime stories repeated with new voices. The house held these sounds like a cup holds hot water. Then, 3 months after Raphael remarried, the edges of that joy dulled. I noticed things at first that I almost could let pass. A rosary that had been on the mantel was on the floor one morning, beads knotted as if it had been walked on. A candle that I always left by the kitchen sink blew out though the windows were closed. Pages of my Bible that related to protection and spiritual warfare had been dog-eared. There were smells too. An acrid, sulfurous scent would appear in the hallway at dusk. It did not belong to any cleaning product. It seemed to arrive like a shadow at the border of the room and then fade when I lifted my voice in prayer. I am not a woman of quick accusations. I watch, I listen, I pray. But the house began to feel watched in return. I woke one night to the television's blue glow even though every set was off. The screen showed only a smear of static as if the static itself wanted to speak. Small rituals in our home had always been private and quiet. A cup of chamomile for Bianca on restless nights. A whispered grace before we all sat at the table. A short verse on the hall wall that we touched with our fingertips as we passed. These gestures used to make me feel like a guardian, not like someone under siege. I remember my mother's voice in those days. She would say, "Little lights keep the dark honest." I held that line like a rope. It kept me steady when a sense of unease began to thicken like morning fog. I also remember the hard lessons the years had given me, the illness that humbled me, the long season without enough food, the funeral mornings when silence learned my name. These were not stories I told to win sympathy. They are memories that sharpened my faith into something practical, prayer, yes, but also watchfulness. The house itself is a map of gestures. The kitchen tile is smooth where our family walks most. The photographs on the wall are arranged as a conversation: birthdays, baptisms, silly faces, a husband's last bright grin. I kept a small wooden cross by the door. A neighbor had carved it for me once and asked me to keep it within reach. I did. My days are made of small, steady acts, sweeping away the crumbs of ordinary trouble, setting the table so the next meal promises a future, folding clean clothes and slipping a note into a pocket for a daughter who needs encouragement. I bake bread sometimes, the way my mother did, slow, rhythmic kneading that hums a prayer. There is a comfort in routine. It is a form of worship without words. Yet routine can become a thin shield when what comes at night is not simply loneliness or fear, but a cunning presence that looks to unsettle what is sacred. Trust is the currency of a house. We treat one another almost like currency, with care, with enough to keep life possible. When that trust is frayed, small things turn into big ones. A late phone call missed. A door left open. A glance that lingers too long on a family photograph. These were the twitching edges of a story I would come to tell aloud. I remember Gabriella's laugh when we first gave Bianca a little desk for crayons. She decorated it with stickers and a promise. I recall Clara teaching Bianca simple prayers that fit into a child's pocket. These are small anchors I return to in memory when fear presses like a hand across my chest. At night, before sleep, I walk the house and whisper protection over the thresholds. I lay my hand on the frames and speak quietly the names of my daughters, the name of my granddaughter. I ask God to keep what is tender and to guard the gaps the world finds. Something else began to show up in the margins: remarks that felt like pebbles underfoot. A casual comment at a lunch about energy and how certain people hold the space. A suggestion that prayer was fine but sometimes one needed other methods. I remember a laugh that sounded thin and brittle when someone spoke of awakening powers. These were small, offhand things, but they started to collect like leaves. I did not accuse. I collected evidence the way a careful gardener notices which plants are choking others. A misplaced key. A dish not returned to its place. A small package of herbs left behind in a room where children slept. I placed these observations in the palm of my prayer and asked for discernment. There is a dignity in watching your family from the place where love allows you to see more than anger. I did not want to make enemies. I feared making the wrong accusations that would break more than they healed. That fear made me slower, more prayerful, more tactical. I find that when faith is practiced steadily, it does not make a woman reckless. It makes her patient and practical. It taught me to gather the daughters in the kitchen and lay out the facts like bread on a table. It taught me to ask questions that were soft but precise. I also began to talk quietly with Pastor Samuel. He listened with a pastor's patience and then with the firm voice of someone who has seen the long war between hope and despair. Teresa, he told me over the phone one bright morning, watch with prayer. Do not let fear decide for you. His words became part of my plan, not a plan of confrontation, but of careful stewardship of the sacred space that was our home. I kept a journal, not for public airing but as a ledger of the small things that mattered. I wrote the dates when odd things happened, the smell I could not name, the time Bianca came home quiet as a kept secret. I wrote also the little mercies, the morning's light cut through the curtains, the sound of children's shoes on the stairs, a supper that left us all warm and satisfied. There are images that I keep with me when the night presses in. A candle that resisted a cold draft and stayed lit. A window that opened and let in a shaft of honest sun after a storm. A small hand clasped into mine in a hospital corridor where we prayed for healing. These are not grand miracles, they are signs. They are proof that light persists even when shadows try to claim the corners. Where there is light, the mal disperses. I try to explain faith as a daily practice. It is not always a dramatic moment. Please tell me in the comments where you are watching from your city and country so we can hold this space together. The peace we kept was about to be tested in ways I could not yet name. I felt the first tremor like a footstep in an empty hallway. I had no idea how loud that step would become. Life in a house with family is a collage of ordinary acts stitched together by trust. We ate at the same table most nights. We divided chores like a small, prideful militia, Clara on dishes, Gabriella folding laundry, me sweeping the kitchen until it smelled faintly of lemon and hope. These routines are how a home keeps breathing. The first weeks of unease were punctuated by ordinary things. A pot left on the stove. A toy not put away. A phone call unanswered. These were the small frictions that felt like coarse sand under a foot. Bianca's laughter grew thin sometimes. She would sit motionless on the arm of the sofa and watch the television with eyes that did not quite belong to a child at play. Other times she would run through the yard, the way a bird tests the air, and then suddenly stop, as if she had forgotten what she was doing. At dinner she once said, casually, "Tia Natalia says Grandma is not as strong as she thinks." There was a pause that tasted like something unsaid. I felt the spoon warm in my hand and set it down. A silence can be a drumbeat. I asked a question that was small and steady. "What do you mean, Querida?" She looked at her plate and then away. I remember the way small children can mimic speech without the burden of understanding. I wanted to believe it was that. But then I found Bianca in the hallway listening to a phone call and saying things that made my skin prickle. "Yes, I did what you said. I put it under her bed." She did not look like a conspirator. She looked like a child who had been coached in sleep. I walked slowly to her school and waited outside the gate. The world there smelled of chalk dust and morning breath. I walked the path of other parents and pretended I was one of them. Inside her bag I found a small black notebook. Its cover was soft with fingerprints. I opened it with a grandmother's trepidation. The pages were filled with symbols that made the hair on my arms stand on end. They were not childish doodles. They were instructions how to place objects in certain rooms, what times to whisper into pillows, phrases written backward like a secret meant to confuse the daylight. There were lists of our names with strange marks beside them. One sentence, written small and precise, read, "The old woman must be broken. Her faith is the shield. Make her doubt." My heart tightened with two things at once, a need to protect and a need to understand. I did not want to paint someone as monster without knowing. But the evidence sat in my lap like a small, cold stone. I began to watch more closely. I learned the sound of the house when it was well, china clinking, low conversation, the kettle's sigh. Then I listened for the different sounds, a door that closed soft as a secret, footsteps that did not belong to anyone who lived there. Once, late at night, I heard whispering in the hallway like paper rustling. I put my ear to Bianca's door and felt a breath of colder air than the room should hold. There were other signs. Clara woke one morning with faint red marks at her throat, like traces of a finger. Gabriella began to wake up screaming, each nightmare a small fissure in the day. The thermostat read alternating temperatures within a single house, one room humid and heavy, another crisp and cold. The house itself seemed to argue with itself about comfort. People around us began to shift. Raphael grew quieter. He moved like a man with a secret he could not quite swallow. He would stand by the kitchen sink, hands in water, and stare at the bubbles as if they could answer him. I began to see the outline of a man whose inner life was being pulled apart by guilt and loyalty. My daughters had their own private storms. Gabriella was ashamed and afraid. She had a spiky tenderness I recognized from the years when her heart mended slowly after choices that left it raw. Clara, younger and honest, kept asking if she had done something wrong. Their love for Bianca made them both furious and aching at once. There are small conflicts that echo the larger fight. Gabriella and I began to edge around each other about how to handle Raphael's choices. She wanted to protect her child, but she also feared tearing a family further. I wanted action and prayer in a measured balance. She wanted swift protection. We argued in low voices, saying sharp things we did not mean, then putting our palms together and trying to stitch back what our mouths had bruised. At the market one afternoon, a neighbor asked in a soft voice if I had noticed my husband's photograph turned face down on the altar at their own home. It was a curious question, and it landed like a pebble. People notice small things. They cluster and pass along what worries them. Word moves through a village like wind, and suddenly what is private becomes public prayer. Natalia was present in these days like a shadow with a smile. She spoke about energies and awakening in a way that sounded fashionable, like a new word on the lips of someone trying to redefine themselves. She would bring herbal teas and talk of cleansing, but there was a hardness in the way she looked at our family photos on the mantel. Seeing her with Raphael was sometimes like watching someone try on a role that did not belong to them. He looked relieved to have someone who soothed him, and I did not begrudge him comfort. But comfort can be a cloak that hides what it covers. I kept watch not because I wanted to spy, but because my house seemed to need a guardian who could see both the ordinary and the edge of it. Another thread of tension was the small jealousy I caught in the way Natalia watched my interactions with Bianca. I would hold the child and sing, and Natalia would smile but not join. There is a certain hunger that sits under some smiles, a hunger that reaches for what another woman wears naturally: the right to be loved by a child, the right to be first in someone's care. These human things complicate spiritual danger. One afternoon, Clara found a small package wrapped in black cloth under Bianca's bed. Inside were dried herbs, small pins, and a folded scrap of paper with our family names written backward. It was the same pattern as the notebook had suggested, items placed to create a pattern of wear on the heart of the house. I did not want to let anger rule me. I wanted clarity. I remember thinking that someone could be deeply hurt and turning toward practices that promised control. Hurt can be a doorway into dangerous things. I kept reminding myself to separate the person from the force. Natalia was not the force. She was a human who might have reached into a dark place. That distinction mattered to me. It kept me from declaring war on a soul when what I needed to do was uproot a thing that lived in darkness. I also began to see the social cost of naming these things. Whom do you accuse in a family without breaking it further? How do you protect a child without making them a weapon? These questions lay heavy on my chest like a loaf I could not rise. At night, there were other small strange occurrences. A photograph fell from the wall and shattered at my feet when I was on the phone with Pastor Samuel. The sound made my bones tingle. A lamp flickered though its bulb was whole. My Bible would sometimes fall open to passages about testing, about persecution. These felt like signposts placed by something that understood our language and intended to unsettle us. I would kneel and pray until my knees ached. I would whisper lines I had learned by heart and yet felt newly alive. Even if I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will not fear. Prayer becomes both sword and shield. It creates a space that light can enter. I started to keep small rituals as a household, locking doors at a certain time, blessing each room with oil, singing the old lullabies on a schedule so the pattern of love would be obvious and constant. The habits of holiness are a kind of armor if you do them together. Where there is light, the mal disperses. There was a moment I will never forget. Bianca woke and climbed into my bed at dawn, hair in a tangle, eyes still half closed. She whispered, "Tia, they tell me to be brave." It is an ugly tenderness when a child must practice courage. I held her and let my own heart break for the smallness of her burden. I began to watch. It is a wound that asks for both protection and mercy. The suspicion grew like a slow tide. Who among us had been the conduit? Who was hurt enough to seek a false control? The question sat in my mouth like an unchewed pill. I spoke to Pastor Samuel and to a woman in the congregation who prays for families. I listened to their counsel and wrote down what I could do that would not escalate harm but would protect the child and the household. I felt the weight of possible betrayal and the weight of mercy at the same time. The paths diverged, to expose and shatter now, or to stand and pray and invite repentance. My soul wanted both. As I closed a drawer that night, I heard a slow, almost satisfied sound in the walls like breath. I placed my hand on the wood and felt a tremor. The next step was clear in my heart even if it was frightening. The house had been marked. Someone had used our children and our habits against us. I would not let the story end with a broken spirit. Something had to be done, but not out of rage. I would prepare, I would gather, I would keep the light steady. The suspicion had a name that I could now almost feel at the edges of my hearing, and I was not yet ready to speak it aloud. My next choice would require courage and a plan that honored both truth and compassion. The night closed in with a promise and a threat. I could feel the shape of what would come. The war of small things had become a battle of hearts. Where there is light, the mal disperses. I kept watch that night, buoyed by prayer and by the memories of the good things that anchored us. I did not know then how loud the next knock would be, only that someone's hand had already begun to rap at our door. The question that kept me awake was simple and terrible. When the truth came, would I have the strength to protect those I love and still reach out a hand to the one who needed saving? That question followed me into the dark. The house smelled of lemon and burned coffee that afternoon, but beneath that ordinary scent there was a copper tang that did not belong to the kitchen. It sat under the tongue of the day like a warning. Raphael's car on the gravel made my heart tighten in a way that had nothing to do with surprise. He brought Bianca inside with hands that trembled just enough to show he had been holding back more than the child's backpack. He kept his head low the way a man keeps a secret in his pocket. I watched him close the door as if it might slam shut on what he had to say. We moved to the kitchen table because it is where truth often settles on a dish, between cups. He asked to speak privately and his voice was small. "Teresa," he said, "there are things I have to tell you." The words arrived like stones. He told me about the basement door latched at odd hours. He told me about whispers that were not quite human. He told me about a woman who called herself a keeper of ancestral love and who had drawn a circle in their cellar. He said he had found paper with our names and he could not explain the dark stains on them. He said he had felt shame at the end of it, and that shame sounded like a confession. As he spoke, the lamp over the table hummed and then stopped. A picture fell from the wall and shattered on the tiled floor, the glass sparkling like a sudden alarm. The shards lay around my husband's smiling face in the frame, and for a second the room seemed to hold its breath. Raphael looked as if he wanted to sink into the floor. I asked the question that had been growing in my chest for weeks. Who is doing this, Raphael? I did not want the answer to be a person, I wanted it to be a mistake. Yet the room tightened around his next words. He said Natalia's name. He said it like someone dropping a hot coal. His face went pale and the color drained from his hands. She brought things into the house, he said. She talked about making us a single family. She said some things would make us closer. She asked Bianca to help place objects. I thought it was nonsense. I thought it would stop. I didn't want to see it. I didn't want to know. You could hear the air change. It was not merely the sound of betrayal. It was the recognition that the hazard had a shape and a face. My mind moved fast and slow at once. I separated the person from the force in my thoughts. Natalia was a woman my son-in-law loved. Natalia was not an enemy to be screamed at. The force that used her, that presence, was what I would name and confront. Where did she learn such things? I asked, calm because my fear needed a place to land. Raphael told me about a woman in a distant neighborhood who sold candles and old powders, who read names from tea leaves and promised power over what fate had withheld. He said Natalia had lost a mother young and that her grief had hardened into a thing that wanted to hold and possess. His voice broke when he spoke of Bianca being asked to do little errands for a ritual, tuck a ribbon under a mattress, whisper a name at dusk. A chair scraped as someone else entered the room. Clara's shoulders were tight. Gabriella's eyes were raw from sleeplessness. They had heard him and they had watched him. The room became a tribunal of quiet. Each of us carried our own anger and fear the way we carry a hot cup. We moved through what he told us like people stepping over broken glass. There were questions: how long, who else knew, why our house? There were explanations that did not explain love entangled with hurt, a hunger for belonging that twisted into grasping. I thought of the black cloth bundle under Bianca's pillow. I thought of the page in her notebook with instructions written backward. When we heard Bianca scream from her room, the sound cut through us like a bell. It was a sound that did not belong to a child. We ran. The hallway felt narrow, the light thin. Her bed was a small island, the covers thrown aside, hair in a mess. She was thrashing as if trying to escape a place inside her that was not hers. And then she spoke with a voice low and rough. "She belongs to us now," it said. The words were certain and cruel. "The old woman will fall. The house is ours." The syllables had weight that settled in the bones. Raphael stumbled back as if struck. Clara covered her mouth with both hands and sobbed. Gabriella's knees hit the floor. I went to the foot of the bed and put my hand on Bianca's forehead the way I had put my own children's heads to sleep when they were feverish. I placed my palm there and I felt a heat that was not mine. I remember the way the world narrows at moments like that. Prayer moves from memory to need in a single breath. I did not shout. I did not panic. I knelt on the floor and I spoke aloud in a voice that had steadiness because it did not rely on me. "Not against my child," I said. "Not against our family. We will break the power that binds, but we will not break the soul it uses." The words were simple, a cord thrown across a chasm. The house responded. The lamp flickered, the curtains shivered though there was no wind, and for an instant the static in the air felt like a presence stepping back to listen. I felt the separation, the human pain that had been used, and the malice that had taken advantage of it. I named them differently in my heart and in my voice. "She is not the enemy," I told the room. "The thing that uses her is. We will fight that thing. We will hold her, and we will bring light." Raphael's hands closed into fists that trembled. He had wanted to hide his guilt in silence. Now confession had opened the floodgates. He told us of small rituals he had seen, pictures turned face down on an altar, strands of hair bound into a knot and buried by a neighbor's fence, herbs burned at twilight. He said it with shame because he had not stopped it sooner. My daughters listened and their faces were maps of hurt. They asked him hard questions that made him flinch. "Why did you let her bring our child into this?" Gabriella asked. Her voice was judicial and sorrowful all at once. Raphael answered in pieces and apologies. Apologies are thin cloth against what has been done, but they are better than obstinacy. The room held the weight of choice. We could react with rage and exile. We could try to pretend it had not happened for fear of rupture. Or we could meet the hurt with a plan rooted in prayer and mercy. I felt the logic of my mother's wisdom settle into me. Small lights keep the dark honest. My hand found naming the threat did not dissolve it. It only made its form visible. My next choice would decide whether we met it with the weapons of fear, or with the instruments of mercy and authority given to me by years of faithful prayer. I tucked that question into my chest and closed my eyes, knowing that dawn would demand an answer. The night after the revelation did not belong to sleep. It belonged to watchfulness. Every creak felt meaningful. Every distant engine was a footstep. At 1:20 a.m., the heating kicked on and the hallway felt like a mouth breathing. My palms were clammy, but my voice was steady when I rose to pray. I took a single candle and a small bottle of oil my neighbor had blessed in the church. I carried them like a flag. The flame trembled but would not go out, a small rebellion. I moved through the rooms and spoke protection aloud because silence had been used against us and speech reclaimed space. I touched each doorframe. I made the sign I learned as a child and I whispered names. I tasted the air as if it were a test. Some rooms felt heavy and closed, like a book someone else had started to read. Some rooms felt ordinary. There was a rhythm in the difference. Where the mal had touched, the lights held a colder hue, the wood a different grain. I remember lighting another candle by Bianca's bed and watching that small flame battle the shadows. The child's breathing slowed and the anger left her face. For a moment I let myself breathe too, as if oxygen were an answer. The house began to make sounds that were not simply the house. There were low murmurings that could have been pipes, and then a pattern beneath them that suggested intention, whispers threaded through a fan's drone. I placed a hand on the hallway wall and felt a vibration that answered to no appliance. It was not fear I felt so much as a deep and holy resolve. Sorrow can teach you to stand. I remembered the long winters after my husband's death, the times I sat up nursing bills and praying for a loaf of bread. I remembered the power of small rituals then, a kettle left boiling, a prayer scribbled on the back of an old envelope. Those were the same small reliquaries of faith I carried into this night. I used these memories to steady my hands. Where there is light, the mal disperses, I whispered, the phrase now a litany as much as a belief. It was a fact I had learned in years of hardship. Light is not loud, but it is durable. At 3 a.m. I heard Bianca cry out in the far room. I ran and found her on her knees in the middle of the floor, hands clenched, speaking words that were not her own. The sound tore at me. I did what I always do when a child is in danger, I sang. I sang the lullabies of her small years, the same lines that had soothed scraped knees and first heartbreaks. The sound of my voice seemed to pull her back like a gentle rope. The words were simple prayers and silly rhymes, but they carried memory and tenderness. Her fists loosened. She looked at me with eyes that belonged to the child she truly was and said, "Tia, it told me lies about you." Her voice was small and fierce. I held her against the tremor of the night. When a child's courage surfaces, it looks raw but brave. I then moved to the kitchen and found a small pile of papers folded into a neat packet. They were placed under the spice rack, as if to be small and secret. On them were lines written in ink that smelled faintly of burned leaves. They listed our names and times and instructions. I gathered them and put them in my apron pocket like a charge. The morning that came was gray and thin. Light arrived through the curtains as if trying to be brave too. I made coffee because the ritual of it steadied the hands. We ate in a silence that was more than grief, it was the planning of survivors. Between one cup and the next we said small prayers. Gabriella paced, putting together a list of what we would do. Clara cleaned with a kind of frantic calm. Raphael watched the doorway as if afraid to move. A neighbor stopped by and lowered her voice when she spoke of what she had seen, Natalia had been visiting a woman at dusk, carrying a sack of leaves. The neighbor's eyes went to the child in a way that was tender and frightened. The world outside our walls was not innocent, but it was watching. That watching matters. People notice the small corners that hide secrets. There are two kinds of response to this kind of wound: to run from it because of shame, or to face it because of love. We chose the latter. The plan was not born in rage. It was born in protection. We would not be theatrical. We would be precise. I wrote down psalms that had an edge to them, words people use when the night is thick: deliver me from my enemies, and set a guard over my mouth, O Lord. I separated the pages I would use and I prayed them quietly until their phrases became muscle memory. Prayer becomes ready. It becomes something you take into your hands like tools. Gabriella and I spoke in low tones about boundaries. She wanted immediate removal of Bianca from Raphael's home. She wanted justice. Her insistence was fierce and she had reason to be furious. Raphael apologized in ways that sometimes made things worse because guilt can be an awkward rawness that presses outward. Clara wanted to call the authorities outright, and I understood her desire to have a formal record. These were the two micro-conflicts we navigated: the demand for immediate protection and the need for careful, spiritually aware action. Both were correct in their instincts. We had to reconcile them. Micro-conflict 1. Gabriella, who wanted swift action, clashed with my caution not to make Bianca into a weapon. I would not risk the child's heart in the service of exposing shame. Micro-conflict 2. Clara, who wanted authorities involved, met Raphael's shame and reticence. He feared judgment more than the danger sometimes. He had to own his failure in order for us to move forward. We prayed and argued and planned. I asked Pastor Samuel to come by. He arrived not as a man with all answers but as someone whose hands had prayed over many beds and who smelled of old hymnals and tea. He bowed his head and then looked at me with a kind of fierce tenderness. "Teresa," he said, "we do what we must, but we do it as those who love." His presence was both comfort and counsel. He recommended that we purge the house respectfully and deliberately. "Blessings," he said, "are not showy. They are steady." He suggested we anoint thresholds with oil and pray aloud so the words could be witnesses. He also asked to see the objects we had found. When I showed him the small packet of papers and the black cloth bundle we had kept folded in a kitchen drawer, he did not flinch. He folded his hands and began to pray. That evening I prepared a bath for Bianca with herbs that smelled of earth and safety. The steam wrapped around us like a cloak. I sang and prayed while she floated in water that felt like an old embrace. I told her stories that placed her in a lineage of survivors, ancestors who had been poor and brave, who had found God in the act of feeding the hungry and sheltering the lost. She listened and her small shoulders loosened. In the quiet after nightfall I slept for a few shallow hours and woke with a taste in my mouth that was metallic and old. There are dreams that are messages and those that are just the mind sorting fear. I had a dream of a garden with a tree so old its roots tangled through an ancient wall. Beneath it sat a woman with hands scarred by life, and she held a bundle and wept. I knew, in the kind of knowing that is not argument but conviction, that our battle would be between rescuing a woman and freeing a house. The weight accumulated. I felt my bones grow heavier with the responsibility. I thought of the many ways one might lose a child to darkness, through neglect, through desperation, through someone's hunger to possess what belongs to another. We spun small nets of light that day: a call to prayer, the arrangement of sleeping places, a schedule so Bianca would not be left alone at dusk. Small lights keep the dark honest. Yet even as we prepared there was a rumbling in me that asked whether mercy without consequence becomes laxity. I thought of my mother's hands and of the look she gave when she forgave but kept her distance. Forgiveness is not an unguarded door. It is a careful unlocking when it is safe to do so. Night fell again, and with it a sense that the test would come to a head. I gathered the things I would need with a methodical calm: a small bottle of olive oil, the Bible with corners softened by years of reading, the packet of papers, the black cloth bundle wrapped in a napkin. Each item had a weight and a purpose. I called my daughters together and we spoke plainly. "We will purify this house," I said. The words were not triumphant, they were precise. We opened windows and doors to let air move like an exhalation. Sunlight flowed into rooms that had held shadow. The light itself felt like a sacrament. We anointed thresholds, each of us touching wood and lip and palm as if sealing a covenant. "May this house be kept," I whispered, "from every violence of the night and from every chain of the past." Our voices combined in a low choir that felt like a shield. I prepared a scented bath for Bianca with herbs that smell of Sabbath: chamomile, rosemary, lavender. The water boiled and steamed and carried away the residue of fear. While she soaked, I sang the lullabies of her infancy and read aloud from passages that speak of protection. The words are an old architecture. They shape the room as hands shape dough. Midway through the morning, Pastor Samuel called. "Teresa," he said, "I woke with your name heavy on my chest. The Lord showed me a picture of you standing at the doorway of a house, and there was a light in your hand." His voice was steady and small. I told him what had happened and how we intended to act. He agreed to lead a time of prayer and to be present for the meeting I planned with Raphael and Natalia. Having him at our side would be both a seal and a restraint. Spiritual authority carried compassion and order. That afternoon I asked Raphael to bring Natalia here. I explained why. I was careful with the words, not to destroy, but to free. It is more difficult to hold out a hand than to lift a finger in accusation. He agreed, shaking as if from fever. He told me Natalia had been reluctant in the first hours, but that she had agreed to come because of a fitful conscience and a loneliness that had grown teeth. I prepared the house for a meeting, arranging chairs in a circle that is humble and honest. I placed a small dish of water at the center and a candle that would not be blown by drafts. There was a space left deliberately open, because mercy requires room to return. I felt the tension build with each subtle shift in the light. The house could hold it. I also took time to prepare my own heart. I prayed not for triumph but for clarity. I knew the difference between condemning a soul and confronting a spirit. The person can be loved while the force that oppresses is rebuked. That separation mattered. The Bible taught me this distinction: we wrestle not against flesh and blood. At dusk Raphael arrived with Natalia at his side. She moved like someone carrying an old grief. Her eyes darted away from mine and sometimes lingered on Bianca with a hunger that was complicated and human. Her arrival did not feel like an entrance of evil so much as the coming of a wounded person who had been taught to seek power in dangerous places. We gathered in the living room. The air had a quality of waiting, like a held drumbeat. When I speak in times like that, I watch for the small cues: a throat clearing, a hand to the face, a child's toe that will not stop tapping. These are the ways lives betray their edges. "Natalia," I said, and my voice was neither soft nor sharp, simply clear. "I have not called you here to shame you. I have called you because I believe you are not free." The room shifted as if at the breath of those words. She laughed once, a short and brittle sound. She told a story that I listened to with the tenderness of one who knows the craft of hard times. She had been abandoned at moments she most needed support. She had been offered a quick fix in the dark. She had wanted to hold on to a man and feared losing him. Her reasons were real. They did not excuse the harm she caused, but they did explain it. When I reached for her hands, they were cool, and for a moment I saw the child behind the armor. She tried to pull away, and the urge to push her into shame made a small hunger in the room. I did not feed it. Instead I said, "You have been taught that control brings love. That is a lie." Once the person had been seen, the force showed its face. The lights flickered sharp. Bianca began to tremble and then to speak in that low voice that ripped the room's calm. "She belongs to us," it said again. "Take the old woman away." The syllables like a brand. I rose and placed a hand on Natalia's knee and on my Bible. I invoked a name that does not belong to me alone. In the name of Jesus, every chain that binds this woman or those she touches, be broken. Leave now, spirit that is not of God. The authority in such a moment comes from namings. There is a legal sound to them. There was a sound in the house then, as if something moved through the rafters and began to loosen. Natalia gave a howl that was equal parts fear and release. Her body arched and her voice became layered with something ancient and cruel. For an instant the living room was a wrestling place between mercy and something else. Pastor Samuel read aloud and our words formed a net. We named what was true and refused the lies that had been whispered in the dark. We prayed hard lines, psalm after psalm, and we laid hands with the firmness of people who had prayed nights in barns and in hospital corridors. The power in a room like that is not in the volume but in the unity of intent. At one point Natalia's fingers clawed the carpet and she gasped, "It told me lies about God. It said he would not listen." She cried out like a person waking from a long captivity. The sound paid for days of ignorance with a sudden honesty. I did not let the moment become spectacle. I spoke to Natalia as one speaks to the injured. "Your pain is real," I said. "Your choices have consequences. But I will not let you be used to harm a child. We will call for help. We will offer repentance a path. We will burn the things that were used to bind. We will not let this continue." The house convulsed once more and then a hush came as if the sky had taken its breath. The candle we had lit burned steady. The documentary rattle of the television was finally quiet. For the first time in days the rooms felt like rooms again. Natalia collapsed into Raphael's arms and wept. It seemed, then, that we had passed through a threshold. The force that had used her was gone for the moment. Her eyes that had been glassy cleared and she looked at us like someone waking from anesthesia. She said words that were thin with new honesty. "I thought if I could control this I could keep him. I thought if I could break what I could not have, I could belong." Her confession was both sin and sorrow. We set things in order with deliberate gestures. Raphael brought the small ritual objects and we burned them in the yard while praying for release and for a way forward. The smoke lifted into the sky like a sign of letting go. I prayed for the woman who had been used and for the small souls who had been endangered. Forgiveness, I have learned, is not a single blaze. It is a gentle reweaving. We forgave her in word and we set boundaries in practice. Biography matters. The person is offered a route to restoration, but the harm required repair. We would not pretend nothing had happened. We would not pretend there were no wounds to stitch. Afterwards we ate bread in quiet. The light in the living room was soft and the children's laughter returned in small fits. The house felt different, not because a miracle had erased memory, but because the present had been defended. We had not made enemies of the one who caused us harm. We had pulled the poison out of our home and offered a hand to the one who had been its vessel. I spent that night in the chair by the window, watching the moon carve a bright path across the yard. I whispered prayers of gratitude and petitions of permission. The battle had moved but it had not ended. Hearts still needed tending. Words had to be rebuilt. Trust would be slow. A thought kept returning like a bell. To condemn the person without mercy is to leave a field of bodies for the next thing to walk into. To forgive without boundaries is to invite repeat betrayal. The work is to hold both truths at once and to act with both grace and prudence. Where there is light, the mal disperses. The house slept in a new sort of quiet, and I would keep asking the hard question that keeps the soul honest: who truly needs saving in the battles we fight? The light in the room was thin, as if even the sun hesitated to enter that house on that afternoon. I set the chair in the center with the deliberate slow of someone making a small altar. Each placement was a prayer in motion: a cup of water, a Bible open to the Psalms, a candle that would not be hurried. My hands moved like a ritual I had learned by living, steady, careful, sacred. They arrived with the sound of shoes on tile. Raphael first, his shoulders folded inward as if apology lived like an ache there. Natalia behind him, eyes bright with a nervousness that could be mistaken for courage. She carried her bravado like a coat on a hot day, unnecessary and ill-fitting. Bianca followed with the small, uneven step of a child still learning which parts of herself were safe to show. We sat in a circle that felt both humble and like the center of judgment. I watched their faces the way a midwife watches a mother in labor looking for the moment of opening. The air carried the scent of boiled herbs from earlier, a soft counterpoint to the metallic tang that sometimes came with fear. Pastor Samuel knelt at my side, not speaking much, only folding his hands and letting the rhythm of prayer make the room like a womb of intention. Natalia's voice was a thin thread. "I don't want to be here," she said at first, and then laughed in a way that tried to thin the room. "What are you going to do, pray me clean?" The laugh was brittle. It cracked two ways, as mockery and as a plea for being believed. I leaned forward. My voice was quiet and precise. "I did not call you here to shame you. I called you to see you." The words landed like nets. I cannot pretend the harm does not exist. But I will not let vengeance drive us. Her eyes sharpened. "You don't understand my life," she said. "You think faith is easy. You think forgiveness is free." I had spent long years learning the economy of mercy. Forgiveness is costly, I had learned. It asks for an accounting and a repair. "I do not pretend to understand every wound," I answered. "But I do know what living under a lie does to a person. Power taken as medicine becomes poison." She said nothing for a long minute. The house made the space feel thick, as if the walls themselves held their breath. Then, slowly, the lights blinked. Not the ordinary blink of old wiring, but a staccato rhythm that felt like punctuation. Bianca's knuckles whitened around the hem of her dress. Pastor Samuel read. He did not read like a man showing off his learning. He read like one who had been kneeling in long rooms, his voice rough at the edges but steady. Psalm lines rose and fell. "The Lord is my rock. The enemy shall not triumph." Our words braided into a net I could feel in my chest, as if language itself could hold back a tide. Natalia shifted. A name came out of her mouth in a tone that belonged to someone else. The sound was low and threaded with a cadence that felt old. "She is ours," it said. "We take. We bind. We keep." The syllables landed in the room like pebbles. When the person within her spoke like that, the separation I had rehearsed showed itself as necessary. The woman sitting before me was not the speaker that moved through her, a force had used her voice. I reached for that distinction aloud. "Natalia, I see you and I rebuke what uses you," I said. "You are not the owner of these words." The house answered with a breath of its own, curtains trembling, a draft that did not come from the window. It was as if the walls had their own lungs. I placed my hand on Natalia's knee. The gesture was simple and human. It was also binding. Compassion does not mean permissiveness. Her body convulsed then in a way that made the room tilt. Her hands clawed at the wooden floor as if scratching for a way to anchor herself. The voice that erupted did not carry her usual timbre. It rolled through the air with the patience of something that had been waiting. "Old woman," it hissed, and in the same breath, "break her. Take the child. Make the household ours." Bianca screamed in a sound that was half prayer and half terror. She hid behind my chair as if retreat and refuge could be the same motion. Gabriella and Clara leaned forward, their faces threaded with fear and resolve. The micro-conflicts we carried in our family, Gabriella's quick anger, Clara's desire for legal recourse, Raphael's guilt, all folded into the moment. Each human fracture was a seam the enemy fancied could be pulled. I stood. I felt the weight of every small ritual I had performed for days accumulate into a kind of armor. Each psalm was a plate. Each prayer a hinge. I spoke in a voice that did not feel completely mine. It felt like the culmination of generations. "In the name that stands above all names," I began, and the simple legal force of naming settled the room. Every chain, every binding, every lie called by any tongue be broken. When I commanded, I watched for signs. Faith does not always shout. Sometimes it is a stubborn whisper that outlasts the storm. Yet the space around us reverberated. Something inside Natalia recoiled. Her mouth opened, and for a moment the loudness behind her voice dropped to a small, human sob. She said, "It told me the world would stop. It told me I would be loved if I took it." Her confession landed on Raphael like a blow. He made no attempt to hide the way his shoulders sank. He had wanted answers and now had one he wished he had never been given. Old guilt surfaced as new urgency. I didn't know. I thought it was. I didn't see the altar. I didn't force her. His voice cracked into the room like a poor apology. "Awareness is the first step," Pastor Samuel said softly. "Ownership is the next." He asked a question that carried weight rather than accusation. "Will you let us help you, Natalia? Not to make you smaller, but to set you free?" She cried then with a sound that was almost animal, raw and immediate. Tears mixed with words. I wanted to be powerful. I wanted him to look at me like he used to. I was tired of being invisible. I heard other things in the pleading: the absence of a mother when she needed one, the sharpness of a life that had been told to get stronger by any means necessary. I did not allow pity to overtake justice. Mercy is not the absence of boundary. I told her plainly, "You will need help. We will not abandon you. But you must consent to be untaught what you were taught. Some doors must be closed." She nodded, in a movement that felt like a small surrender. The force inside her howled. It fought like a jealous thing with claws. It spat words that were venomous and old, and for a heartbeat the room filled with a pressure like the breath of a beast. Yet our voices would not break. We read Levitical prayers and psalms of deliverance. We pronounced truths that knit themselves into a shield. The battle was not cinematic. There were no bolts of visible lightning. There were details that felt larger for being small: a candle that steadied, Bianca repeating a lullaby she had not sung aloud in weeks, Pastor Samuel putting his palm on Natalia's forehead and whispering a blessing like a balm. Each small act had the intimacy of sacrament. At one point Natalia pulled away and looked at me as if to slough off an old skin. "Why won't you hate me?" she demanded. Her eyes were red, her expression violent with confusion. Because hatred would have fed the thing using her, I thought. Because vengeance could never build the kind of repair needed. I answered slowly, "Hate would only give it more room to speak. I refuse to barter with evil. I will hold you accountable. I will offer you a path to change." We set terms then, clear and tender. Raphael would remove the objects and not allow their return. Natalia would attend counseling and the church group without pressure to prove anything but willingness. Bianca needed protection. Visits would be supervised and scheduled with care. Gabriella needed a promise that her child's safety came before convenient explanations. We will teach you how to kneel without lying to yourself. It was a promise of labor and of gentleness. We lit one last candle in the living room. It burned steadier than any I had seen in days. Its glow did not erase the past, but it made the present honest. We closed the circle with a prayer that felt more like a vow than a plea. The house exhaled. The night had been answered, but not concluded. There would be repair. There would be trust to rebuild and scars to tend. The enemy's voice was quieter, but not gone forever. We had wrestled and held the line with speech and love. The real work, the slow unteaching and the building of new habits waited like a long road. Where there is light, the mal disperses. I would watch that light. I would tend it. I would not let the house forget how to be a home. The hours after the confrontation were not soft. They were full of small, slow things that serve as stitches. We moved like people who had been in a storm and now needed to sort the wreckage. Food tasted like repair. A cup of tea was not just warmth but a covenant. I made soup in a pot that simmered as we sat around the table in the lingering dusk. Natalia sat at the corner of the table as if testing which side of her face would be met by the light. Raphael hovered between apology and gratitude. Gabriella's jaw was set in a way that suggested both relief and ongoing resentment. Clara cleaned plates with a quiet so deep it felt like prayer. Bianca ate with an appetite that felt like a child's hunger for ordinary things. We burned the objects in the yard with a ceremony that was neither triumphant nor theatrical. Raphael brought out the small bundles wrapped in string. I held the match and struck it as if striking a bell. The smoke rose and climbed into the sky, and we watched it become small. We prayed as the flames licked the edges and took away the tangible evidence of the lies. The act was necessary. Fire is an old kind of witness. Natalia watched in silence, tears tracking clean lines down her face. At one point she touched her chest and said, "I thought I was making a place for myself. I didn't understand I was making a prison." The honesty in the admission felt like a key. We ate afterward in a quiet that was not empty but mending. The meal was simple and whole: bread, boiled vegetables, a salad. I broke the bread and passed it around. It felt like a sacrament, not because of any ritual I placed on it but because of the intention that threaded the room. We were sharing something we could not burn. After the dishes, I sat with Natalia on the small sofa. She asked me questions that cut through the residual arrogance she had once worn. How do you pray when the house is loud? How do you trust what you cannot see? I answered with the candor of someone who had been taught by loss. We pray when we cannot see the road. We keep our hands on the rail. Trust is built by small acts, returning when you could stay away, speaking the truth when lies are easier. She nodded, as if trying to memorize each syllable. We spoke about vows and about what making amends looked like. There would be counseling, yes. There would be accountability. There would be hours in which she would have to demonstrate change, not with words but with repeated small choices. Bianca came and sat between us, her small hand warm in mine. She leaned into Natalia, and the sight of it nearly broke something open in me. Children forgive quickly when they feel safe, and they forgive not because they forget but because they need continuity. Bianca's forgiveness was a medicine none of us could have handed. That night I prepared a bath for her, with the same herbs I had used before: chamomile, lavender, rosemary. The steam rose and the room smelled like Sabbath. I sang to her the lullabies I had sung 1,000 times. Her shoulders dropped. The small tension of recent weeks loosened, and for a few fragile minutes she floated in a peacefulness that had been scarce. I talked with Pastor Samuel late into that night about the work ahead. He had the quiet way of a man who had carried too many burdens to be surprised by pain. "This won't be quick," he said. "Remember that deliverance is a process. The spirit might have been rebuked, but the patterns that invited it will take time to unlearn." His words were practical and stern. We planned the small things: a schedule for Bianca, a rule for overnight visits, a pastoral check-in with Raphael, a sponsor group for Natalia. We would not pretend healing was immediate. We also set the lines we would not cross: no more secret rituals, no unmonitored nights, and an insistence that Bianca's welfare precede any desires to salvage a flawed intimacy. There was also the matter of community. We would ask the church to hold a time of prayer and restoration. Not to shame Natalia, but to integrate her into a structure that could sustain change. People need webs, I thought. They need others who will show up and hold them to promises. In the days that followed, the house learned to feel like itself again in small increments. The television remained off unless there was a planned program. The children played in the yard where we had burned the objects. The curtains were drawn in the evening like a gentle closure. Each ritual, mundane as washing dishes or sweeping floors, became a rehearing of what safety might mean. But the work was not only exterior. It was interior labor that required humility. I found myself checking my words before I spoke to Natalia. Forgiveness is generous but also discerning. It refuses to be naive. There were moments when old anger flared in me, a sharp, hot thing that wanted to feed on her humiliation. I would fold that anger into prayer, naming it and then putting it aside. At one point, Gabriella confronted Raphael in a way that ruffled the skin of family already tender. "You left us alone with this," she said, voice low but edged. "You brought her into our orbit, and now we pay the price." He listened with a face that they had learned to read, shame threaded with resolve. "I couldn't see it," he answered. "I see it now. I will not run from it again." That exchange was a micro-conflict that mirrored the spiritual one. It echoed the larger truth: human error opens doors that spirits want to walk through. Accountability in ordinary life is a kind of safeguard against the extraordinary. Natalia attended counseling sessions. She was awkward at first, all defensive armor and rehearsed lines. Then she began to let into that space small cracks where sincerity could bleed. She started attending a support group at church where women met to tell the truth of their lives and to listen. There were nights she sat late with Pastor Samuel, learning to pray without self-display. There were days she repented, not as a public spectacle but as small admissions: "I lied. I was jealous. I made poor choices." For Bianca, the protection was both spiritual and practical. We set boundaries that did not punish her for someone else's choices. We scheduled therapy and art sessions. We taught her refusal as kindly as we taught her to share. She learned new words for agency. She learned that love could protect and not possess. Slowly, the household regained its rhythms. Morning prayers returned to their place before breakfast. The rocking chair on the porch resumed the habit of my early hours. I walked through the rooms and blessed thresholds as habit, not superstition. I found that repetition of small holy tasks was its own kind of armor. The community response was mixed, as communities are. Some people stood by us without question. Others whispered judgments in the grocery aisles. We did not court gossip. We did not hide either. There is a balance to be struck between transparency and dignity. We learned to speak truth with both firmness and tenderness. One afternoon, deported from the ordinary, I found a letter slipped under my door. It was from a neighbor, short and trembling in the ink. I am sorry for not seeing. If you need anything, I will come. The note read like a small redemption. People notice when they choose to notice. In private, I kept watch over my prayer life as if it were a garden that could be trampled if neglected. I prayed for Natalia's transformation and for our family's healing. That night, as I sat at the window watching the moon cut a silver path across the yard, I felt tired in the bone and grateful in a different place. The house breathed softly. The TV was off. The curtains clung to the night. Where there is light, the mal disperses. But light is not self-sustaining, it needs tending. We had tended the flame through tears and resolve, through ritual and consequence. We would tend it for a long time. We had burned objects and delivered words and laid down structures of care. Yet the deepest work was not in the burning but in the rebuilding, in the teaching of new habits and the gentle insistence that mercy requires labor. Forgiveness is a road that must be walked, not a flag planted at the site of an event. I learned, as I often do, that saving another soul is not about force. It is about presence, about the stubborn willingness to stand at the gate and refuse to hand someone back their old lies. It is about holding a hand steady while a person learns to place their feet differently. Months passed. Natalie's steps became less tentative. The household no longer held its breath at every creak. And yet I kept watch because the history had taught me that vigilance is not paranoia but stewardship. Where there is light, the mal disperses. I would keep the lamp trimmed and the doorways marked. Weeks turned into a careful rhythm. The house learned to breathe without panic. Bianca's laughter returned, soft and surprising like a bird testing the air. Natalia began to show up at church groups without defiance and with an awkward, brave humility. Raphael sat with his guilt and tried to turn it into repair. This story did not end with a single shout. It ended with many small truths. We did not pretend the past had never been. We kept boundaries that respected the harm. We offered paths for restoration that required work and witness. Mercy did not mean erasing consequence. Restoration did not mean immediate trust. I learned a lesson that sits now with me like an old proverb: the most dangerous violences are often those that arrive wearing our unhealed places as keys. The enemy, whatever name you give it, often finds its doorway through our own hunger, our own fear, our own loneliness. Natalia was not evil, she was wounded. The force that used her was not human, it was a lie made tangible. We confronted both without collapsing into easy answers. In my kitchen window, the wooden cross I keep warmed under my palm each morning. I touched it as the sun rose and gave thanks for the small mercies of each day. Where there is light, the mal disperses, would whisper, not as a magic incantation, but as a practice. The phrase became a tether for my heart. You might ask, as I sometimes ask myself, who needs saving? Is it the child who was used, the woman who used her, the man who failed to see, or the house that learned to hold grief? The answer is yes to all. Salvation, in my experience, is not a single act but a network of repair. It asks us to be brave both in rebuke and in reaching. If you are watching and your home feels like a battleground, remember the small things: light a candle, speak a psalm, call an ally who will pray with you and hold you accountable. Notice who needs help and who needs boundaries. Pray for discernment more than certainty. Love with a firmness that has room for consequence. Please, if this story touched you, tell me where you are watching from. Tell me about the small lights you keep in your house. If you can, subscribe. This channel is new and every voice helps us reach more people who need a story like this. We are building a community that sees the spiritual and the human together. I will end with a thought that keeps me awake some nights. Victory is not a shout but a series of steady steps. We do not always triumph in the dramatic. Often we triumph in the mundane, in supervising a child's visit, in keeping a promise, in teaching a woman how to pray without lies. That is the work we are given. Keep your light trimmed. Keep your doorways guarded by love. And keep asking the hard question, who truly needs saving in the battles you fight?